Gayle King has spent a career pulling truth out of people who would rather keep it buried. When DNA testing turned that same pressure onto her own family history, the results did not arrive gently. They dismantled an origin story built on assumption, reached across an ocean she had never thought to look toward, and surfaced a genetic lineage her family had carried for generations without knowing it existed. What science found was more specific and more consequential than anyone anticipated. Before we dive in, comment where you are watching from and click subscribe. There is a particular irony in being the person everyone else calls when they want the truth pulled out of something. King built her career on that. The follow-up question, the patient silence after an answer that does not quite land, the professional instinct for knowing when someone is telling you less than they know. It is a skill that takes decades to develop, and she developed it in full public view. It did not work on her own past. The ancestry question had no one to interview, no reluctant source, no document she had not thought to request, no angle she had not considered, just a gap where the family history should have been real, structural, and old enough that no amount of journalistic persistence was going to close it. Her father's military career had scattered the family's geography across multiple states and at least one foreign country before King was a teenager. Turkey was part of her childhood, so was the particular rootlessness that comes from moving often enough that no single place ever fully claims you. That kind of upbringing produces adaptable people. It does not produce deep genealogical memory. What she knew about her ancestry was roughly what most African Americans of her generation knew, which is to say not much that could be verified. A sense of Southern roots somewhere. No specific country, no ethnic identity that had survived the crossing intact. No family elder who could trace the line back further than grandparents without the story dissolving into uncertainty. This is not a gap unique to her. It is the predictable result of a historical process that was designed, in part, to produce exactly this kind of not knowing. The families were separated, the names erased, the origins made inaccessible. None of that was incidental. It was the condition under which millions of people were forced to live, and its consequences did not end with emancipation. They accumulated. They were passed down. They became the silence that sits at the back of the family history for generation after generation, waiting for something the documents were never going to provide. The 1870 census is where the paper trail ends for most African American families, not because the families ended, but because before that line, the federal government did not record enslaved people as people. The slave schedules that preceded emancipation listed human beings by age, sex, and a number representing their market value. No names, no birthplaces, no relationships, no indication that the person being counted had parents, children, a language, or a place they had been taken from. That was the design. Slavery as an economic system required the erasure of individual identity. A person with a known origin, a documented family, and a recoverable name was harder to hold in permanent bondage than a person who existed on paper as nothing more than an entry in a ledger. The stripping of names, languages, and ancestral knowledge was not incidental to the institution. It was one of its mechanisms. The Freedmen's Bureau records that followed emancipation captured some of what the slave schedules had omitted. Names appeared. Family relationships were sometimes noted. In certain regions, the records are detailed enough to push a family tree back past 1870 by a few additional years. But the Bureau was chronically underfunded, politically undermined, and gone within a decade. Its coverage was uneven at best. Entire communities, entire states left almost nothing in its files. What this means in practice is that for a family like King's, the documentary record runs out long before it reaches anything resembling an origin. The Southern roots that family tradition suggested, the vague sense of somewhere below the Mason-Dixon line passed down through informal oral history that fills gaps when written records cannot, pointed in a general direction without landing anywhere specific. Plausible, unverifiable, the kind of inheritance that feels like knowledge until you try to confirm it. DNA changed the terms of that problem without solving it entirely. It could not name an ancestor. It could not produce a document. What it could do was reach past the wall the records had built into a history that existed long before any American census thought to count it. What it found there was not what the family had imagined. Henry Louis Gates Jr. did not set out to make television. He set out to answer a question that academic genealogy had never been able to resolve at scale. Where precisely did African Americans come from? The African American Live series that resulted was a research project first and a documentary second, and the distinction mattered. The genetic database Gates's team assembled for the project was built specifically to support comparisons that no commercial ancestry test of the time could make. It drew on DNA samples from populations across sub-Saharan Africa mapped against the historical record of the Atlantic slave trade to produce identifications that went beyond broad regional estimates. King was among the participants. What she brought to the process was the same thing every participant brought: a family history that documents had failed to complete, and a DNA sample that the lab would read against a database assembled for exactly this purpose. The methodology layered three distinct forms of genetic evidence. Autosomal DNA captured the broad ethnic ancestry picture, the percentages, the regional affiliations, the overall composition of the genome across both maternal and paternal lines. Mitochondrial DNA traced the direct maternal line, unchanged across generations, back to its ancient point of origin. Where applicable, Y chromosome analysis extended the same precision to the direct paternal line. Each layer answered a different question. Together they produced something closer to a complete picture than any single form of analysis could provide alone. What the process could not do was guarantee certainty at the level of specific ethnic identification. Genetic ancestry analysis compares a sample against reference populations, living communities whose DNA represents the best available proxy for historical populations. The match indicates statistical similarity, not confirmed descent. Gates was careful about this distinction throughout the series. The DNA was pointing, not proving. The difference between the two is not a minor technical caveat. It is the boundary between what science can responsibly claim and what it cannot. With that boundary clearly drawn, the results still had considerable distance to travel. And the direction they pointed when King's analysis came back was not where the family narrative had been looking. The results placed King's African ancestry along the western coast of the continent, in regions whose histories are bound up with the Atlantic slave trade in ways that are specific, documented, and considerably more complex than the broad phrase West Africa tends to suggest. Among the populations the DNA connected her to were groups from present-day Nigeria and the surrounding region, communities that had been at the center of one of the most heavily trafficked corridors of the entire transatlantic trade. The Bight of Benin and the Bight of Biafra together accounted for a substantial portion of the enslaved people carried to North America. The ethnic groups that lived along and in Lanasin from those coastlines, Yoruba, Igbo, and others, were not peripheral to the story of American slavery. They were among its primary sources, and their descendants are distributed across the African diaspora in numbers that reflect that history directly. What the DNA identification meant, practically, was that King's ancestry was no longer pointing at a continent. It was pointing at specific peoples with specific traditions, specific languages, specific cosmologies that had survived the Middle Passage in fragmented but traceable forms. The Yoruba religious and cultural influence on African American spiritual traditions, music, and community structure is documented across generations. The Igbo presence in the American South left its own distinct imprint. These were not anonymous populations absorbed into an undifferentiated African mass. They had histories before the slave trade, and those histories did not disappear simply because the trade tried to erase them. For King, the identification represented the first time the family's origin had a name attached to it. Not a country in the modern political sense. National borders in West Africa are colonial constructions that rarely correspond to ethnic or cultural boundaries, but a people, a place with a history that runs deeper than any border drawn in the 19th century. That history was now hers, in a way it had not been the day before the results arrived. What the DNA still could not tell her was how her specific ancestors had entered the trade, whether through warfare, raid, or the economic coercions that the system used to feed itself. That part remained, as it almost always does, beyond reach. The African ancestry results were not the whole picture. They were not even the most complicated part of it. A significant portion of King's genome traced to European origins. The percentage was consistent with what Gates's team had been finding across the broader participant group. Not a trace, not an anomaly, but a substantial genetic presence that had been sitting inside her family's bloodline for generations without ever being named or acknowledged. It was, in that sense, exactly what the history predicted. The mechanisms that produced European ancestry in African American genomes are not mysterious. They are documented, studied, and in most cases traceable to a specific set of conditions that existed across the antebellum South for more than 2 centuries. Enslaved women had no legal recourse. The men who owned them faced no legal consequence. Children born from those encounters were classified as enslaved under laws that tied status to the mother, regardless of the father's identity or race. The result was a systematic transfer of European DNA into African American bloodlines that was never intended to be acknowledged, and that was legally structured to remain invisible. King received this information without theatrics. What she offered instead was the kind of measured response that comes from someone who has thought seriously about history, a recognition that this finding was not surprising in any analytical sense, even if seeing it confirmed in a laboratory result carried its own particular weight. She had known, in the way that anyone who knows American history knows, that this part of the story was likely to be there. The DNA simply made it visible in a form that could not be argued with. What it could not make visible were the people behind the percentage. No name attached to the European ancestry in her genome. No county, no family line, no record of acknowledgement from the other side of that history. The DNA confirmed the encounter. It could not identify the person. It could not tell her whether anyone descended from that line had ever looked back in this direction, or whether the silence on that side of the family had simply continued undisturbed to the present day. The maternal line is where genetic genealogy goes deepest. Mitochondrial DNA does not dilute, does not blend, and does not get overwritten by a father's contribution in the way that autosomal DNA does across generations. It passes from mother to daughter intact, carrying a code that has remained essentially unchanged across thousands of years of human history. When researchers sequence it, they are not reading a recent genetic average. They are reading a direct transmission, a signal sent from one specific woman to the next in an unbroken chain that reaches back further than any document, any oral tradition, any recorded history can follow. King's mitochondrial haplogroup placed her direct maternal line within a lineage with deep roots in West and Central Africa. The specific branch identified showed a distribution pattern consistent with populations that had inhabited that region of the continent for thousands of years before the Atlantic slave trade began, before the Portuguese arrived on the West African coast, before any European power had drawn a line across the continent. The maternal line running through King's family was already old when the history that would eventually displace it was still centuries away. That finding Rifra MES something. The story of African American ancestry is usually told beginning with the slave trade, with arrival, with displacement, with the violence of the crossing. And that story is true and necessary. But the mitochondrial result inserts a chapter before that one. The women in King's direct maternal line were not defined by the trade that eventually consumed their descendants. They existed before it, within societies and traditions that had their own depth and continuity. The trade interrupted that continuity. It did not begin it. What the haplogroup cannot do is name those women. It can place them in a region, connect them to a population, and trace the broad arc of their ancient movement across the continent. The science is precise about what it can establish and honest about where it stops. The specific grandmother, the specific village, the specific life that was interrupted, those details are gone in a way that no laboratory result will ever recover. Something else remained to be examined, and it was the part of the picture that the family had never considered at all. King's family had carried an origin story that amounted in the end to a direction. Somewhere south, somewhere before the migration north that brought her parents' generation to Maryland. A sense of southern roots that felt true without being traceable. The kind of inherited geography that sits in a family's self-understanding without ever resolving into a specific place or time. The DNA did not confirm that story. It did not contradict it either. The southern roots were almost certainly real, in the sense that her ancestors had almost certainly lived in the American South before emancipation. But the DNA pushed past that layer entirely, reaching back through the American South, through the Middle Passage, through the coastal regions where the trade had loaded its ships, and into a West African ancestry that predated every part of the American story by centuries. What that does to a family narrative is not simple. It does not replace one story with another in a clean substitution. The Southern history is still there in the migration patterns, in the cultural inheritance, in the specific flavor of African American community that formed in the urban Northeast during the 20th century. The DNA does not erase any of that. What it does is extend the frame. The story that King grew up inside turns out to have a much longer preface than anyone in the family had been able to read. There is something particular about receiving that kind of information as a journalist. The professional instinct is to follow the evidence wherever it leads, to update the account when new facts arrive, to resist the attachment to a previous version of the story simply because it was familiar. King has that instinct in full. But the DNA results were not a story she was reporting. They were a story she was inside. The distance that journalism requires was not available. What she said publicly about the experience reflected that. Not transformation, not crisis, something quieter. The sense of a picture coming into focus that had always been blurred. The names were still missing. The faces were still gone. But the outline, at last, had something to hold it in place. The complete picture that emerged from King's DNA was not the one her family had been carrying. The Southern origin story, the vague sense of somewhere before the migration north, the absence of any named homeland, all of it had been a placeholder, reasonable given what documents could provide and insufficient given what they could not. The DNA replaced the placeholder with something specific enough to stand on. West African ancestry, connecting her to peoples whose histories run deep into the pre-colonial past. A European genetic presence whose origins, given the historical context, required no elaborate explanation. A maternal haplogroup tracing the direct female line back thousands of years to a region of the continent that had been home to her ancestors long before any of the forces that would eventually displace them had arrived. 3 distinct findings, each answering a different question, each pointing in a direction the family narrative had never been able to reach. She came into this process as someone whose professional identity is built on asking the right question at the right moment. What the DNA test revealed is that some questions cannot be answered through skill or persistence or the right source willing to talk. Some answers were buried not by reticence but by design, by a system that spent generations ensuring that the people it exploited would have no recoverable record of who they had been before the exploitation began. King did not fail to find her ancestry. Her ancestry was taken, and the DNA recovered what the taking had left behind. That recovery is partial. It always is. The names remain missing. The specific lives that produced her genome on every line, African, European, the full human complexity of it, remain without faces or stories or the kind of individual detail that makes history feel inhabited rather than abstract. What the science returned was a geography, an ancient lineage, and a set of ethnic connections that are real and meaningful even without the personal details that would make them complete. She spent a career asking questions that got to the truth of things. This one got answered by a laboratory. The truth it produced was bigger than the questions she had thought to ask. The DNA recovered a geography that 2 centuries of erasure had buried. It placed her ancestry in specific regions, connected her maternal line to an ancient human story, and confirmed a European presence whose origins the history makes self-explanatory. What it could not recover were the individuals, the specific people whose lives on every line produced the person sitting across from those results. Science returned the map. The territory, the names, the faces, the particular human weight of each erased life remains uncharted. It probably always will.